everyone, happy Friday. Have you ever known a quilter who was also a master roller skater? Well, you're about to. I'll be back right after this message. Welcome back. So I sat down with Tara Faughnan, who I learned roller skates in her spare time, is a professional freelance textile designer and a quilter who lives in Oakland, California. She started to quilt around 2021 using a reprint of the 1931 edition of a 101 Patchwork Patterns by Ruby Short McKim as her guide. Crazy. Her love of quilting led to school and to a career in textile design with clients like Michael Miller Fabrics, Riley Blake, and Pottery Barn Kids. Like, how cool is that? Color interaction is the key inspiration that drives Tara. And for her, the explorations are endless with that. Tara is teaching this week at our Spring Quilt Festival online, and she's also teaching at our Create coming up in June, June 10th to the 12th. She only has a few spaces left in her workshop, so if you're interested in taking classes with her, I would get on our website, quiltfest.com, and sign up for her classes. And now, a great interview with Tara. Hi, Tara. How are you today?
I'm good, Diana. How are you?
Good, thank you. And where are you Zooming from?
I am in Oakland, California, which is in the Bay Area, across the bay from San Francisco.
We know it very well. The Pacific International Quilt Festival, of course, is in Santa Clara, California every year.
Yep.
And we love the Bay Area. It's just such a fun place to visit when we have like a free day. We've gotten whale watching. We've done hiking with the redwoods. It's just awesome.
Yeah, I saw some whales last week.
Did you?
Huh?
Oh,
yeah,
that's
I
awesome.
went to the beach. We had a heat wave. I went to the beach and we saw whales. It was amazing.
Oh, it's definitely in the top 10 of the most amazing things I've ever seen. Yeah, that's just really cool. I can't wait to get back there and to take my kids. So I think they would really enjoy it. Well, so why don't we start by talking a little bit about your background? How did you start? Did you have a job before being an amazing quilt show instructor?
Excuse me. Yeah, right before the pandemic, what did I do versus what do I do now? How far back do you want to go, Diana?
As far back as you want. College, after college.
Well, let's see, I moved up to the country. My then boyfriend, now husband, moved up there in 2000, and my mom cleaned out her sewing room and gave me all of her, like a bunch of sewing supplies, her old machine. And I went to school for biology. And then, I became a doula for a while because, and then right after that, I went to textile design school because they're super closely related. Right? So I was just kind of a jack of all trades. And then I landed in textile design school about 5 years after I had started quilting. And I had the idea that I was going to become a pattern designer for the quilt industry. And luckily, I didn't know that there were literally no companies here in the Bay Area because I might not have gone to school. There was one company, but they moved. And who was that? Not P&B, but it was, who was out here? They were in South San Francisco. Anyways, they moved to the East Coast. So there was literally no fabric companies out here in the quilting industry. And I started working at Pottery Barn Kids in their textile department for about 6 months. And then I got a phone call that Michael Miller was looking for an in-house designer, and they happened to have their art studio was in California. The rest of the business was in New York, but the art studio was in California. There were 2 employees. And I said, sure. I went. It was up in Sonoma, so it was quite a haul for me, but it was my dream job. And it was literally the only job. Mm-hmm. And so I went up there and I started working there, and I worked there for about 10 years in-house, working on the in-house lines. And then I left that a few years ago, went back to Pottery Barn Kids, and then the pandemic hit. And I've been freelancing my whole life because I have a total fear of commitment. So I'm fine going on Monday to Friday as long as I'm a freelancer. So sadly, when the pandemic hit, the freelancers were all the first to go. And I've been teaching for a while and hauling my stuff back and forth across the country, and just realizing that it really wasn't financially a good trade-off to take time off of work to go and teach. I thought it would be amazing, and it was, but there was like yet another Saturday night where I was hanging out by myself in some city. And I just realized that it was kind of had to come to an end. So I was debating all of that when the pandemic hit, and then I started teaching online. And that is what I've done for the rest of the year, this whole entire year. And it's been amazing. I feel very grateful for so many things that came out of this time. It was like the best of times and the worst of times this year, right? It was like the worst of the worst. But then for me personally, to be able to teach online this amount, so I teach, I don't even know, I just came off of a 6-week period where I think I was teaching like 2 or 3 times a week for 6 weeks. It was amazing. So not only have I been able to reach people everywhere, but my skill as a teacher has become so much better, because before I was teaching 2 days a month.
Mhm.
And so the amount of experience that I've had this year as a teacher has been really, really incredible. The whole thing has been really incredible. So that's where I am now.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
That's a great story. And I think that actually a lot of people out there would agree with you about it being the best and the worst, because I mean, of course, the worst things are obvious, but the better things is that, yes, someone that wouldn't normally be able to take a workshop with you can, from their very own home, and don't have to lug their sewing machine. And I think a lot of people out there are super grateful for that.
Mhm. And the community that it's created, like, I was so in isolation for the first 3 months of the pandemic because I wasn't working. My husband, he, neither of us were allowed to go to work. And I was just very isolated, like everyone else in the world, and just be able to get on Zoom and teach those classes and connect and create the community it just saved me on a
Yeah.
lot of levels.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think our company has been really happy that we've been able to provide our virtual quilt shows and provide the online workshops to kind of, just combat that kind of isolation and fear, feeling like we're totally alone out there, when you can get on a group of, 20 students and see your friends and, talk with other quilters. It's really amazing. But to go back to your designing of fabric, so what would you say the difference between designing for Pottery Barn Kids rather than designing for Michael Miller fabrics?
Yeah, big difference.
Yeah, what would you say is like, do you feel better about doing the quilt fabric designing, or
Yeah,
tell us a little bit about that?
I really enjoy the textile design for the quilting industry. And now I work for Riley Blake doing some in-house line and just helping in other ways. And so I really enjoy that because that's my passion. Pottery Barn Kids, I play more of a supporting role to their textile design department. So mostly doing color and layouts and that kind of thing. I love Pottery Barn Kids because it really is, all the things that you see in their catalog, somebody is sitting there gluing that, painting that. I mean, it's all made in-house. So it's very creative environment. It's fantastic. And then it's sent out to get mass produced. But, somebody will be next to me embroidering, somebody else will be on the other side of me with a glue gun, and somebody else is cutting wood, making costumes and painting. And so it's very, very creative, and it's a great place to work. That being said, we're all doing it from home. I am doing some work for them again, but everybody's at home now.
Right.
But I really love the quilting industry because at Michael Miller, I had a bit of an unusual role in that there was only 4 of us in that studio in California. And I worked with one of the co-owners, and she had been in the industry for 40 years. She started Timeless Treasures and then started Michael Miller Fabrics. And I was able to really have a lot of autonomy in what I wanted to do, what I wanted to create. She would always, be like, no, yes, no, yes. I mean, she was in charge, but I had a lot of autonomy. And if I had an idea, I could sell it to her, And so I worked with color a lot, and that was a great passion. But the wonderful thing about the two different companies was that Michael Miller's, especially when I worked there, a lot of novelty fabrics. They were fun, poppy fabrics. The colors were bright. Pottery Barn Kids, I mean, barely their pink is like their motto, right?
Okay.
So to be able to work with two different color palettes really, really expanded my color horizons. And to be able to work with color every single day was such a gift. I mean, it was just, that is how I learned all about color and value and contrast and proportion and all of the things that I started to apply to my quilting. And I kept the two very separate. When I worked at Michael Miller, I was very, very protective of my quilting. So I didn't I didn't do quilts for Michael Miller very often. Every once in a while I do one, but I kept those two very separate. And I think that it's really interesting because on one side, as a designer, you really do have to learn how to design for mass market, what's marketable. And then I could go home and in my own quilts do exactly what I wanted to do that wasn't marketable, do weird color combinations, do whatever it is that I wanted to do. And I really loved having that balance between the two.
That's really neat. Well, what was your first textile that you created, and what's your favorite?
Okay, the first one was funny. I sent you guys the picture. So I started working at Pottery Barn Kids, and I was an intern. That's how I started. And I'm not a painter. I'm not a painter at all. And they had no reference books, and they would come to me and be like, "Okay, paint some frogs." I'm like, "Okay, sure." And so I would go back to like the frog that I painted when I was 8. That's the frog that I put out there. And they would look at it and they were like, "It's so naive. You have such a wonderful hand." I'm like, "Oh, thanks." So I did this. They wanted this whole winter scene. They're like, "Do penguin skating, and we want some polar bears and throw an igloo in there, and people, polar penguin skiing." I mean, it was ridiculous, and I was literally sweating. And I was like, "Okay, got it, done." So I painted. I mean, if you look at it, like the deer legs, like I can't draw legs that are even. They're all different lengths, But they loved it. They were like, "Oh, it's so naive." And like,
Well, that's
so
awesome.
So I painted that design, and then it became the entire holiday line, which was so exciting for like my first venture out in the world. I mean, we put it on shower curtains, bath mats, it was on plates, mugs, the whole thing was based around that design. And then I went home for Christmas, or took a week off for Christmas or whatever, came back, and they're like, "Tara, I'm so sorry. You're going to find out, but they dropped the whole line and we're starting from scratch again." Like, which was very typical of how it worked at Pottery Barn Kids. So that design ended up getting dropped and going nowhere, which was very sad, but it's a funny story. It's fake it till you make it.
Oh my gosh.
I'm definitely better at rendering.
And then your favorite pattern?
My favorite pattern, that is actually from my grandma's apron. So she made these aprons, matching aprons for her and my mom when my mom was little. So my mom's apron was this little tiny one, and I brought it in and we created a whole line around it.
That's awesome. That's very special.
And then so then I gave my mom, she sews, and she mostly sews garments. So I gave her yards and yards of it, and she made dresses for my niece and made new aprons. And it was
That's really cool.
really amazing to be able to take something that's so special and then reproduce it and have it again.
Yeah.
That was probably my favorite.
That is cool. I agree. Well, so for our spring quilt festival right now, you are teaching 3 workshops this week. That is the Scrappy Lone Star, the color interaction, and the modern log cabin. Can you tell us a little bit about those 3 workshops and what students are learning this week?
Yeah, so the Scrappy Lone Star, the reason why I went with Scrappy rather than the strip piece is because A, there's a ton of tutorials on strip piece Lone Stars. And B, when I made one, I really wanted to have control over color placement and value placement and have it maintain somewhat of that radiating look of the Lone Star, but be able to place colors and values where you want them. I'm also a huge proponent in learning all the techniques. So, we go over Y seams, bias, how to sew angled pieces together, all of the tips and tricks that have to do with that quilt. I mean, it's such an iconic, like the Lone Star, it's like the bucket list quilt, that and the double wedding ring for me and my, the bucket list quilts. And a lot of people want to make them, and it's really hard if you don't know all the tips and tricks. Once you know all the tips and tricks, it's pretty easy. So that's the Lone Star. Color interaction is definitely one of my favorite classes, in that what we do is color exercises. So we play with how colors look when they're next to each other. What makes a color look brighter? What dulls it down? Things like that. We have just exercises for several hours, and then we go into making the bars quilt, which is really a quilt that advanced people, quilters and beginning quilters can make, right? Because you can play with rhythm and shape and form and flow if you're more advanced, and if you're more beginning quilter, it's just rectangles, right? You're just sewing rectangles together. It's super easy. So that's the color interaction, and really it should be called value color interaction, but I'm lying, because it's really all about value, because it's all about value. Value is so important. And it's how you can take two colors that are looking, fine together and make them really pop and sing. That's value, right? And then what was the last class? Modern log cabin. Log cabins are just a favorite of mine. And I really love the look of the simplicity of this block, with those colors and the really skinny logs, two colors repeating, but it's also about color interaction. When I did my very first log cabin that was like this with these colors, for me, it was, looking at how a color might change when it's placed against a dark red versus a lighter red versus a pink, so we play with a lot with color and value in that class as well. Well, really in all of my classes, it's about color and value, and then how you apply it to different quilt blocks.
Right. It seems like the modern log cabin is a popular class these days. Do you feel like that is the case? It seems like that particular class is super popular right now.
I was really surprised. I've never taught it before. No, I did teach it once, but other than that, I've never offered it online. And I thought, well, really wanted to offer something new online. I had taught it about a year ago, actually, to a bunch of people, and everybody loved it. And it's so simple. And I think that there's something, I don't know what it is about it that's drawing people to it. I love it. I mean, I've made several of them, and I continue to make log cabins always. Log cabins are they're a palette cleanser. It's like my go-to. You could make a log cabin for the rest of your life and not get bored. Right. Just, through the use of varying the width of the strip, or what colors you do, or, there's so many variations. And so maybe that's what it is. The log cabin is, when you think of quilts, the first thing you kind of think of, or if you see it on a TV show, it's almost always a log cabin. I don't know if you've noticed that, but it's almost
we're going retro these days. Maybe that's the case.
Yeah, I was excited that was so well received. Yeah.
Well, so in your opinion, why do you think it's important to teach quilting and textile arts to our younger generations?
That's a really hard question. Was that on the sheet, Diana, or did you just slip that in there?
It was, but
like, wait, how did I miss that one? Why do I think it's important to teach it to the younger generations? When I started quilting, nobody else my age was quilting, right? I mean, I would go, that picture that I put in there was my mom and I in Paducah, and everybody thought I was there with my mom, reluctantly, but really she was there with me because it was the first time I had a quilt in a show. But I was younger than everybody by a good 30 years at that point. And to watch the rise of how quilting has come back into fashion has been really exciting, because younger people are starting to quilt. When I was doing that, when I was in my 20s and I was quilting, and my friends would come over and they're going out to shows and they're like, Tara, this is crazy. You should just come out with us. This is what my grandma sits at home and does. And I'm like, I know. And she's awesome. And that's what I'm going to do. But to see it come back in younger people, there's a connection that I was kind of worried was going to get lost. I mean, I know that there's men in the quilting world, and I don't mean to belittle that, but it is a women's history. And to me, there's something really beautiful and important. And beyond that, there's a lot of oral history in there. And if it doesn't get passed down, it's just going to get lost. And I think that there is so much in quilting, like if you're trying to learn how to do hand quilting, you can watch stuff online, but honestly, your best way to get information is to ask somebody who's been quilting for 60 years to tell you all about it and show you the stitch. How do I hold my hands? It's oral. There are a lot of aspects to this that are still oral tradition. And I think that's part of teaching is like, here's all of my tips and tricks and I'm passing them down. You just don't get that. You don't get that out of patterns, you know? So I really love that connection. And honestly, the quilting industry was dying.
Right.
It really was back in, you know, the early 2000s when I started. I learned how to quilt from all the Quilters Newsletter magazines. So I read all the articles from the very first one, and American Quilter Society, right? I remember that was a really good magazine. And so I had all of those magazines and I just read them cover to cover. And there's so much history there. But one of the things that was coming up is how the quilt industry was literally not money wise, like it was getting bigger and bigger, but people wise was shrinking. And that, you know, I think that whole craft revolution that happened that started with knitting, remember the whole knitting, and I think it just led to all the other crafts, and the pandemic certainly helped a lot of new quilters.
This is true.
You know, well, you're getting back to the basics. You're like putting up vegetables and quilting.
Yes, I know. Well, that is the truth. I even myself, like, you know, the beginning of the pandemic, I'm like, I think I'm going to take up knitting again. I think because that's, you know, that is what my mom does. And I was like, oh, but then I realized with 2 young kids, I didn't have time for that. So
yeah,
another time. But I do think it, you know, I think also in what you were going back to what you were saying about the color and value. I mean, even quilting teaches, you know, young artists about value and how to play with color and with the different textiles. And I think that you know, a younger generation finds that to be exciting.
Yeah, and to be able to make something for yourself. I mean, I think that's the allure of knitting and crocheting, right? You take a piece of string and then you can make a sweater. I mean, that's amazing. And the same with quilting. You can just take a bunch of scraps of fabric and pretty soon you have, you know, a blanket. Don't shoot me for saying that. I realize quilts aren't blankets, but
but I mean, to some people they are, and I think that it's like that. Even I see you know, some quilting tutorials on TikTok as of late.
Oh wow.
Yeah, they're doing, but this one particular girl she makes a pillow quilt. So she makes pillow squares, so it's puffy, and then she sews them together. And I don't know if she backs it or not, but I mean, I just thought that was really interesting. And it's a younger girl. So I definitely think, you know, the craft is there, you know, it's just a matter of keeping people, you know, interested. So switching gears, talking about your studio, I can see a little bit of your studio in the background. What do you like most about your studio?
It gets good light in the morning. It's really small. I have had to spruce it up since I'm doing so much teaching on Zoom. I mean, I sent you that picture and I'm glad you didn't use it, but I was such a slob for 20 years in here. I mean, it would just be so bad I couldn't even walk. So it is nice and neat for me. I really like having a design wall. I think that's key. And I inherited a very large old drafting table. When UC Berkeley, they were literally throwing out all of these beautiful wooden drafting tables. So I sew standing up. And I highly recommend if anybody, you know, I was too poor when I first started quilting. I didn't have a desk. All I had was this drafting table. And so I just set my sewing machine up on the drafting table, didn't buy a desk because I, you know, was young and making do. And then I've just stayed sewing standing up. And it's really wonderful because, you know, it makes it easy to sew a log cabin because you got to sew and iron and sew and iron. So I just turn back and forth. And yeah, I've got good light sometimes.
Well, that's really interesting that you sew standing up. I don't think I've heard of that before. And what machine do you sew on?
I have an old Pfaff. Well, now it's old. It was brand new. It's a 2040 Pfaff. I love it. And I know, and I bought 2 on Craigslist now for replacement parts because every time I take it in to get it serviced, they try to cannibalize it. They're like, we'll give you $300 for your machine. I'm like, yeah, that's off my machine. So they're not making parts for it anymore, which is really sad because I love that machine above all else. It gives me a perfect 1/4" seam. It can sew through denim, knit, and cotton using the same needle and the same setting. Like whatever you want it to do, it will just do it. And it will do it beautifully. So
that's a real workhorse. Yeah, that's great. That's awesome. So what do you do when you're not quilting?
Well, I garden, and now I roller skate rapidly. That's mostly what I spend my time doing.
Yeah, how did you get into roller skating?
A few years ago, a good friend of mine started roller skating again. She pulled out her roller skates and just put them on, and I jealously watched her do this, through pictures until I finally bit the bullet and bought my own roller skates. And that's what happened. And honestly, so I live here in the Bay Area in Oakland, and there's a huge roller skate community that was brought out into the streets before they were all in the roller rinks. And if you weren't in the roller rink, you didn't know what was happening. And then as soon as the pandemic hit, I'd been roller skating with a group of people, but the pandemic hit, and all of a sudden the street was filled with roller skaters because the rinks have all been closed for an entire year. So now pretty much every night of the week, there is something going on all over Oakland and Alameda, out where the sun sets on the old naval base. And there's quite a few places in Oakland right on the water where there's skate events, but every single night of the week there is a skate event, usually with DJs and food, and it's just a giant party in the street. It's amazing. So not only
sounds amazing,
good exercise, it's just so fun, and you're outside, you can be masked and social distance. So I think that it's, also talk about something that's trending. Everybody's roller skating now. So it's really exciting to be
that's really cool.
Outdoors roller skating right now. Yeah.
So do you know any tricks?
Yes.
You do? Oh my gosh.
Yeah. Yeah, I like to dance.
You should get someone to video you at some point so you can see your tricks.
That's most of the pictures that I have is of me roller skating. I have a lot of pictures of me roller skating, none of me quilting.
Yeah. Well, that's such a fun hobby. I mean, and it's exercise too. I wish we had that on the East Coast, and maybe we do. I just haven't heard of it yet, but that's really cool.
It's everywhere. It's really interesting. It's and it's great exercise, and it's outdoors. And I live here in California, and we really basically are heading into a horrible drought. But the great news is that it was pretty dry all winter, so we were roller skating all winter too.
Well, that's awesome. Well, thank you so much, Tara, for coming on today. I really appreciate that you would tell us about your background and tell us about your classes. It sounds like you have a lot going on the West Coast, and it's all good.
It is. Well, thanks for having me, Diana.
Awesome. Well, if anybody missed out on taking any of Tara's workshops at their Spring Quilt Festival this week, there is another opportunity for you to take the Scrappy Lone Star and the Modern Log Cabin at our next virtual show, which is Create, which is June 10th to the 12th. So if you just go on our website, quiltfest.com, you can register for her classes, and you better do it quickly because her classes always sell out. Thank you so much, Tara. It's great to have you on.
Thanks, Diana.
Thank you, Tara Faughnan, for that amazing interview. As I mentioned before, if you're interested in signing up for any of Tara's workshops for Create, please go to our website, www.quiltfest.com. She has a few spots left. Next up, I will be back with Martha File from the Upstate Heritage Quilt Trail at 12:30, and I'll see you then. Thanks.